Good evening. When Pete asked me to pick a Sunday, I jumped on Super Bowl Sunday because I knew most everybody would be home watching the Super Bowl. Things change in the world. Watching television has changed so much since I was a kid. Those of you who are roughly my age can probably remember waiting with bated breath for The Fugitive to come on each week, or Gunsmoke. But the thing was, you set a time in your week when that movie was going to come on or when that show was going to come on, and you waited with anticipation. Well, among the many blessings of modern technology is binge watching cable television. And I didn't, for years, I didn't watch much television sports, but recently, and I blame this on my wife, I've begun to binge watch some of these things with her. And you know, you've always heard the old saying that if you put 100 monkeys in front of a typewriter and left them there for 1,000 years, that they would recreate all the works of Shakespeare. I'm not sure that's quite true. But along those same lines, if you watch enough television, occasionally you hear something pretty smart. And I'm impressed when I hear something pretty smart. I'm impressed by intelligent people, and I'm impressed by the fact that there have been intelligent people as long as the world has existed. Sincerely, you think, well, gosh, 1,000 years ago they didn't even have iPads. Maybe not, but they could sail from Europe to the United States and hit pretty close to the same place every time. That's pretty smart. You wouldn't catch me getting on one of those boats, getting out of sight of land, particularly with the idea of going across the world. But in watching television, last week I heard something that really struck me, and we're going to get to it in just a moment. But when the comment was made, it made me realize that there are lots of things that we just don't know because maybe we haven't been taught them or maybe we forgot about them. Let me throw you a couple of names. Elisha Gray and Antonio Meucci. Anybody recognize those names? Well, if I gave you the name Alexander Graham Bell, you'd recognize that, right? Okay, well, Elisha Gray and Antonio Meucci were people who had discoveries as significant as Alexander Graham Bell in dealing with things like the telephone. It's just that, number one, they weren't in our neighborhood, and number two, their ideas, while incredibly important, were not the culminating ideas that resulted in the telephone as we know it now. I'll give you a couple of names that will sound maybe a little more familiar to you. Luigi Galvani and Alessandro Volta. Recognize those? They're not household names, but Thomas Edison is a household name. And these guys were people who worked in the field of electricity and the development and application of basic electricity as hard as Edison did. One of the things that has struck me most, I guess, in conversation or in news in the last 20 years, and this is not a political statement, let me say this real quickly. Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense for a number of years. He's still relatively active out there in certain circles, but he made this comment. He said, "Reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to see because, as we know, there are known knowns. In other words, there are things that we know that we know. We also know that there are known unknowns. That is to say that there are some things that we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the ones that we don't know that we don't know. And if one looks throughout the history of our country and other free countries, it's the latter category that tend to be difficult ones. And so the question becomes, what are the unknown unknowns in our lives? What are the unknown unknowns as we go through our day, as we communicate with each other, as we come to church? Hold that thought, and we'll come back to it in a moment. Going back to the idea of binge watching, there's a series called Madam Secretary, It's based on the highly fictionalized possibility that our actual governmental leaders work for the good of the nation rather than for the good of the party. And one of the things that I've learned from it more than anything else is how to pronounce the names of countries that I had never heard spoken in legitimate conversation before. But in this conversation, or this series that I was watching last week, the Madam Secretary is the Secretary of, what's she the Secretary of? I forget. Pardon me? State, that's right. She's Secretary of State. It's very loose. She's a blonde, middle-aged Secretary of State. Does that sound like anybody you know? Anyway, she was scheduled to do a commencement speech at a college. And, of course, a world crisis came up and she had to leave. And so she left her speechwriter there to speak in her place. And it was it was kind of a comical lead up to it. But when he got up to make his speech, he got up before this group of graduating seniors from a well-known university, and he said, yes, I am not who you were thinking. I'm filling in. And I want to quote to you now. He says, I am not Madam Secretary. He said, I mean, honestly, this is probably the first real moment in my adult life that I've stood in the spotlight. Truth to be told, it's probably going to be the last. Why? Because I am one of those people who works in the dark. In this world of relentless self-promotion, we've all been raised to think that the limelight is the only light worth seeking, but that isn't the case. And if I can impart one thing to you today, a small, simple truth to carry with you as you walk through those gates, it's this. Achievement is often anonymous. Some of the greatest things have been done by people you have never heard of, quietly dedicating their lives to improving the lives of others. That really struck me, because you think back over your life and you ask the question, who has worked in your life or in the lives of your children, or perhaps in the lives of your parents? Who does things that we have to have done regularly that you don't know about? I'm not going to mention any names tonight. I don't want to point anybody out and embarrass anybody, but ask yourself this. Who prepares communion for us every Sunday? We take communion every Sunday. What would happen if we came to church and there were no communion? Who prepares communion? Who prepares the PowerPoint presentation that we see on the screen every morning? That doesn't just pop up there on Sunday morning. Somebody does that. Who teaches your kids what we believe about Christ and what we think are the important things, not only to be taught, but to be memorized in the Bible? Who locks the building after services? Who takes the contribution to the bank and gets it in the bank? You ever think about that? You ever wonder about that? There's a quote that I found that addresses what we're going to be talking about here. If you want to, you can turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 12. We'll get there in just a moment. It's a very familiar passage with you. We're going to be looking at verses starting with verse 14. But this is an anonymous quote that I found while researching this, and it says, "What we receive by reaching our destiny is not nearly as important as what we become by stretching toward it." These things that I asked about a moment ago, who does these things? You can fill in the blank with the activity that you're pointing at. What I'm pointing at tonight is involvement in the church. An involvement on a degree that may involve doing something that nobody knows about, that nobody sees, but has to be done. In 1 Corinthians 12, start with 12, it says, "The body is a unit, though it's made up of many parts. And though all its parts are many, they form one body. so it is with Christ. For we're all baptized by one Spirit into one body, whether Jew or Greek, slave or free, and we are all given the one Spirit to drink. Now, the body is not made up of one part, but many. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason cease to be a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, it would not for that reason cease to be a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? And if the whole body were an ear, where would the sense of smell be? But in fact, God has arranged the parts of the body, every one of them, as He wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. Going back to the speechwriter's comment about the limelight not being the only light, light is an interesting concept. We've talked about it a number of times. It reveals things, but it also, along with revealing, illuminates things. It brings attention to detail. There are limelights. Houston gets to be a limelight. He gets to get up in front of the congregation every Sunday and Wednesday and be seen. And, the elders are seen by us all. The deacons are involved. And we know that these things that take place usually take place under the supervision of these men. But they don't necessarily do all these things themselves. They have a lot of help. They are like the moon. They reflect light that is shone upon them. Those who work in anonymity make the church work. Yes, we've got to have major decisions made, and we've got to have paths of action set forward, but somebody has to carry out those paths of action. And the action that is part of that may be very insignificant to the person doing it, but if it didn't get done, where would we be? Where would we be on Sunday morning without that communion bread? Where would we be Thursday morning at 2 o'clock in the morning if somebody didn't lock up after Wednesday night services? So the point tonight is, ask yourself, where do I fit in on this? What is my light that is not the limelight? What can I do to help? What can I do to participate? What can I do to support the activities of the church? Pam and I were in Tennessee recently, and we were working with a guy down there. He was a realtor, and he's a member of the church. Before we went down, we called a church down there, and we said, give us a recommendation on a realtor, and they did. And we went down, we met with this guy. Nice guy. His name's D. Bracey. He's not a super outgoing personality, but he is, he's a hard worker. And as we were riding around, we were asking him a little bit about his church. And he would tell us a little bit about his church. And he said, our church really puts a lot of emphasis on evangelism. He said, I'm not much of an evangelist. He said, I really need to work on spreading the word. I just need to get better at that. But, we'd love to have you guys come to church with us tomorrow. And so later that afternoon, we wound up going back to see him again. And when we got back to see him this time, he had all the information. He had the visitor's packet. He had everything that was printed for that church that he could give us. And, he didn't make a big deal out of it. He just kind of said, hey, if you want to look at this, here it is. But you know what? He did his part. We were at his church the next morning. He did his part. We need to do our part. And it may be as small as handing out an invitation or extending a verbal invitation. We need to be that light that illuminates others. I would encourage you to think about that as you go through each day. Not what great, incredible thing can you do for the congregation or for God's church. that would bring great glory to it, but what little thing can you do that will continue to aid and support the auspices of the church? If you've never become a member of the church through baptism, those waters are available to you tonight. If we can pray for you and help you in any way, you have that opportunity also as we come, or as you come, while we sing the invitation.